All morning, the stormtroopers forced their way through gaps in the Allied lines, which were already weakened by the artillery barrage. Armed with light machine guns, hand grenades and flamethrowers, they swarmed forward. Whenever they came up against particularly stubborn resistance, they'd skirt around it, looking for weak points elsewhere and seeking out the more exposed artillery positions in the rear. The stormtroopers left the job of mopping up any remaining strongpoints to the main infantry force moving up behind.
With gaps appearing all along the front line, tens of thousands of Ludendorff's regular German infantry now advanced and were surprised at how quickly they broke through. The British had lost control of the situation.
We crossed a battered tangle of wire without difficulty, and at a jump were over the front line. The English jumped out of their trenches and fled by battalions across the open. They stumbled over each other as they fled, and in a few seconds, the ground was strewn with dead. Only a few got away.
Thousands of British troops were cut off and surrounded and forced to surrender to this remorseless attack. Thousands more, suffering from the effects of gassing, coughed and staggered their way to the rear where they hoped to find some shelter. By midday, the British troops facing the attack had lost a third of their number.
A full-scale British retreat had begun. For days, the German advances continued. Then, on April the 5th, the Allies finally managed to stand firm, just 11 miles from Amiens.
Ludendorff's first offensive had won a remarkable series of territorial gains for the Germans. That village is the furthest they got.
Here it is, Villers-Bretonneux.
They'd advanced 28 miles and made a massive dent in the British front line. But the British line had not broken. Over the next 8 weeks, Ludendorff launched 4 more offensives. Here, 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 and here. The last advance took them to within 37 miles of Paris. Each time, the offensives fell short of that crucial breakthrough. Despite everything Ludendorff threw at them, the Allies were holding on.
The outcome of the First World War now hung in the balance. The Germans had extended their front lines so much they were now stretched very thinly along the length of the Western Front, and the Allies were finally starting to regroup. It was a critical point in the race against time.
That would mark the tip of the German advance towards Paris. Control of it gave the Germans a key strategic foothold on the road to the French capital. If the Allies were to prevent Ludendorff from strutting down the Champs-Élysées, the German stronghold in Belleau Wood would have to be cleared.
In the blazing heat of June the 6th, Allied troops prepared to start their advance on this wood. But these men weren't British or French. Instead, the task of clearing Belleau Wood had been given to the United States Marine Corps. For the first time in World War I, the Americans were going on the offensive. Even though it had been 14 months since the United States had declared war on Germany, this had not been long enough to master modern tactics. Now the US Marines prepared to retake Belleau Wood in the old-fashioned way, advancing line abreast. Over their heads, American guns laid a barrage of shells to soften up the German defences. But the advancing Marines were in for a nasty shock. Hidden amongst the tightly packed trees, there were units of dogged German soldiers, veterans of the Russian front. They had the perfect cover for their machine gun nests and interlocking fields of fire. When the Marines got close enough, the Germans let rip.
We hadn't gone 50 yards when they cut loose at us from the woods ahead. More machine guns than I had ever heard before. I have a vague recollection of urging the whole line on faster. We came to an open wheat field full of red poppies, and here we caught hell.
Some of the Marines fought their way through the machine gun fire and managed to establish a small foothold in this forest, but it cost them terrible casualties. Elsewhere on the battlefield, one young American officer was told to retreat by some French troops that were pulling back. He famously said, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here."
The difficulty with Belleau Wood was that you never knew where the front was. While you were fighting in one direction, all of a sudden, without warning, you would find there's some Germans to the rear that needed to be mopped up. That was Belleau Wood.
Five times the Marines made headway, 5 times they were beaten back. But on the 6th attempt, the Marines finally prized Belleau Wood away from the German grip. It had been a terrible cost. In their first encounter with the Germans, the US Marine Corps suffered 10,000 casualties. With the Allied victory at Belleau Wood, Ludendorff's path to Paris had been blocked. The Marines hadn't won the war, but they had helped save the Allies from defeat. More importantly, the Germans had come face to face with the Americans for the first time, and the doughboys had delivered a massive psychological blow to German morale. No one could now doubt that the Americans were in the war for real.
If those in front of us are fair specimens of the average American troops, and if there are as many as they say there are, then goodbye for us.
Throughout the spring offensives, Ludendorff had committed everything he had, and he now came face to face with the plain truth. That his army was exhausted and overextended, and he had lost more men than he could ever replace. And for all that, he'd still failed to break the Allied line.
Now the Allies had the opportunity, and they seized it. They would now take the fight to the Germans.
The Allied attempt to break through on the Western Front would be led by a British general, Sir Henry Rawlinson. Rawlinson had been the commander at the Battle of the Somme back in 1916, where 58,000 British soldiers had been lost in one day. This would be his chance to prove he'd learned the lessons of past battles.
The Allies now came up with a plan for a counter-offensive. That was one of the most significant initiatives of the war. It was to be a milestone in military